Does God exist? Is the Bible really the Word of God? Was Jesus really the Son of God? What's the meaning of life? Romans 1:19 says that for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, his creation, so that men are without excuse. And yet it seems that all around us, men are suggesting that belief in God and God is simply a figment of your imagination. In this series, we are going to make a scientific case for the existence of God. Your teacher in this series is Dr. Stephen Meyer. Now, Dr. Meyer has worked as a geophysicist and a philosophy professor, and he authored the book, The Signature in the Cell, DNA and the Evidence for Intelligent Design. You may have even seen him in the movie Expelled. In this first lesson, we're going to lay the groundwork for the entire series. Here's Dr. Stephen Meyer.
Hey, I'm really glad to be with you guys today, and I want to welcome you all. It's exciting for me to be back in the classroom. I was a college professor for 15 years, but the last 7 years I've been doing something a little different. I've been doing research on DNA and the question of the origin of life. I work at the Discovery Institute in Seattle, and my colleagues and I are interested in a number of what you might call the big questions. We do scientific research, but we're also interested in how that intersects with questions like the origin of the universe or the origin of life, and whether or not there's purpose in the universe. And so I'm interested in these kinds of questions, but when I was a college professor, one of the things I really loved about teaching at that level was that college students are often very interested in these big questions about whether there's purpose or meaning in life. And those are some of the things we're gonna look at in this class. One of the things I learned, though, when I was working with college students, people your age really hate to be told that they should believe something for some arbitrary reason, whether it's some politically correct professor telling them what they ought to believe, or whether it's their parents telling them they ought to believe something because it was what the family's always believed or what their church has always believed. And the first teaching assignment I had was at a Christian liberal arts college. And I found that students there were especially kind of annoyed to be told that they ought to believe the Bible because the Bible says so. That seemed kind of circular to them. And I first encountered this with a student who later became, I think, maybe one of my favorite students I ever had. He was a big football player. And I was right off the boat back from England. I happened to, I'd done my PhD work at Cambridge University. I came back and I had kind of forgotten in the 4 years that I'd been away that there were these people called football players. And in my very first philosophy class, I walk in and I got all, these things going through my head. I look in the back row, and there's the whole defensive line. And I'm thinking, these are the guys that used to torment me in high school. How is this ever gonna work, Well, it turned out one of these guys he was one of the most brilliant students I ever had. And he had come to the college where I was. It was a religious college, it was a Christian liberal arts college. And he'd come not for the Christian mission of the school, he'd come to play football and to chase girls. And he was very good at both of these things. And within a few weeks, he had all these conversations with young women on the campus, many of whom were devout Christians. And he came into came in is not quite the right word. He came to my office one day, and I heard this enormous, and I thought, that's got to be Lars. There's only one guy that can be. And no sooner, I'm not even up out of my desk, and he bursts into the door. It's like whatever happened to hello. And he says, this place drives me absolutely crazy. And I said, well, what do you mean? He says, I'm talking to people. I'm trying to be open in dialogue, and find out what they believe. And I've been talking to these girls in the dorm, and they won't date me because I don't believe what they believe. Okay, so then I want to find out, what do they believe? And so I ask them questions. And then I say, well, why do you believe that? and they always say the same thing. And he's kind of getting kind of uncomfortably close, you know. And he says, they always say, well, I don't know, you just have to have faith. And he says, he puts his hands kind of close to my neck, you know, and he says, why can't somebody give you reasons for faith? And I'm kind of backing up and thinking, so I said, why don't we do a class on that? And he says, I never forget the look on his face. He pauses and he says, you mean you think there are some? And I said, well, yeah, I wouldn't believe what I'd do if I didn't. And he said, and he paused again, and I said, look, let's talk about this some more. I'll start sketching out some ideas for class. And we got talking about it. He said, that would be awesome. He said, I don't believe there are any things like that, but I'd be really interested in hearing about that. So we got talking, we ended up offering a class, and over a number of years, I've taught a class that I call Reasons for Faith. And it's, the idea of it is rather than giving people, encouraging them to believe for some arbitrary reason, we want to look at the big questions. Questions like, does God exist? Questions like, who is God? Questions because from a Judeo-Christian point of view, the Bible reveals the nature of God. Questions about the reliability of the Bible. We're going to be looking at some of those big questions, and we're going to be looking at it from the standpoint of evidence and logic and reason. Now, when my friend Lars came and kind of impressed upon me the need for this class, I partly offered it right away because out of self-defense, but I also had some other reasons. I actually sympathized with him a lot and with guys like him who have big questions that aren't getting addressed. And part of the reason I sympathized with him was that I had the same experience. And then for me, it started, I was about 14, and I started having these weird questions, and I couldn't answer them, and they kind of scared me. Things like, well, what's it going to matter in 100 years? And that was the only way I could put words on it, but it just kept coming back into my head. And it was the sense that, you know, every morning you wake up, you make the bed, and the night you go to bed and you unmake the bed, and then the next morning you do the same thing. And there was this kind of repetition cycle to life, but it never seemed to go anywhere. And I thought, what is there kind of some ultimate purpose to all this? Or are we just kind of doing this routine over and over and over again? And at the time I thought maybe I was insane, but then later I learned when I got to college that these are the kinds of questions that philosophers asked. And the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre had a famous quote. He said that without an infinite reference point, nothing finite has any lasting meaning. And I thought, yeah, that's what I sensed when I was 14. I thought I was insane, but actually I was a philosopher. And then I learned later that somebody said that there's a fine line between philosophy and insanity, but never mind, okay. So anyway, I really sympathized with my student friend, but the other reason I was eager to offer that class, I actually found that I think there are great answers to the big questions. And I think it's really important, and that's maybe the third reason to think about doing a class like this. It's really important that you sort out these big issues about whether there's purpose in the universe, about whether there might be a God, whether you can know that being or not in any kind of personal way. Because there's, I think, a lot of kind of quiet desperation with people living their ordinary routine lives, but not really having a sense that they're going anywhere. For some people, these issues are really, really intense. For other people, it's less intense, but they're still there. And for all of us, I think we need to address them so that we've got some sense of where we're going in life. So that's part of why I'm excited to do this, because I had a lot of these questions for a long time, and it took me a long time to unravel and investigate, and in some ways I'm still investigating. But that's what makes me real excited to share this material with you, is that I think there are good answers. And so for that reason, we're going to do something a little bit unusual in this class. I'm going to present a case. Now that seems like a little odd, because it might seem, you know, most college classes or high school classes, the teacher describes different points of view. I'm going to make an argument. Now the reason I'm going to do that is that I think there are answers to questions. And it's not that I want to shut down questions. It's that I think that by making an argument, I used to tell my students, I'm going to do you the dignity of making you an argument. Why is that a dignity, to make a case to someone? Because it allows someone to participate with you in the process of evaluation of ideas. I'm going to give you, I make the argument, you get to evaluate it. You're the judge, the jury. You get to decide whether what I'm saying makes sense. And if I'm making a good argument, I'm also going to have to engage people that take a completely contrary point of view. And you'll see in the way that many of my lectures are structured, that we're going to first talk about what the dominant point of view is on a given issue, and what the conventional wisdom is. And then I may take a contrarian point of view and explain why I think differently. But I'm going to present evidence and argument and logic to try to persuade you. Your job is to decide whether or not I've been persuasive, and to question me, and to talk back, and to argue. okay? So it's all open and fair game, okay? So that's kind of the approach we're going to take. Now, before we get into actually providing some reasons for faith, I want to look at some key concepts. And the first one is just the idea of faith. And then I want to ask you a question or two before we get going. When you think of faith, what's the connotation that you associate with that term? You say, well, I have faith that so-and-such is going to happen. What's the kind of connotation that? Yeah.
I would say it's like, it's not a leap of blindness, but that it is rather a step into what you know to be. So it's an action behind what you already know.
Okay, that's a meaning of faith that I'm kind of sympathetic with. But is there a more common meaning that's kind of the opposite of that? Do you ever run into the idea that faith is like what you believe in, but you're not really sure is going to happen? Or, I don't know that the Dodgers are going to win tomorrow, but I have faith,
It's like hope.
Yeah, it's just kind of a hope. Maybe not even a well-grounded hope, but okay. So sometimes faith is something you believe that's kind of uncertain, all right? Now you're saying it can also be the opposite. It might be something you believe in, a system of belief for which you have some really good reasons, all right? And that's the other meaning. That's kind of where I'm going. You gave me the answer I wanted before I wanted it. See? I want to draw out all the wrong answers first and then get to the right answer. It's not really a question of the answers, actually. It's that there are different connotations of the term, right? So one connotation is kind of something you believe that's uncertain, okay? But you believe it anyway because you have faith. It's something you muster up, a kind of internal confidence. Typically, we associate that meaning of faith with religion. But it turns out that even scientists have faith, all right? One of the things that scientists have faith in is that the inferences that they make from evidence are actually true. They can't be sometimes absolutely certain, but they try to make the best inference they can to try to explain and make sense of the data. But they don't get absolute certainty. Oftentimes also in science, well, always in science, you have to assume some things about the world. They're sometimes called presuppositions. So you can have faith in the sense of believing in some presuppositions. One thing scientists presuppose about the world is that every event has a cause. We can't actually prove that because you haven't seen every event. We also assume that nature will be uniform and orderly and that the same basic laws of physics that apply today are going to apply tomorrow. We have a kind of faith in that, but we can't prove that because we're not there yet to tomorrow. So there's a kind of uncertainty even in those disciplines which we charge to give us knowledge, okay, like science. The third, no one said this idea, but if you're thinking in religious terms, faith is sometimes what we talk about as far as our trust or belief in God's presence. Sometimes it's a kind of subjective thing. Well, I have faith that God is with me. I have faith in God's presence or power, okay? That's another meaning of faith. There's nothing wrong with any of these. They're just different connotations of the same term. But I just want us to be clear on the kind of faith that we're going to be providing reasons for. My personal hope, because I think I have a faith in this faith number 3, a subjective sense of God's presence in my life. I hope that you all have that or find that if you're seeking it. But that's something that very often also needs some intellectual support. Now we're kind of getting to the definition that you had in mind. Faith is also a kind of belief in a system of thought or a personal philosophy. Or another way to talk about it is the idea of a worldview. How many of you are, by the way, familiar with that term, worldview? Most of you? Okay. What's a definition of a worldview? When we talk about a worldview, what is a worldview? Yeah.
Kind of like like the lens that you see through the world as what is true and what's not.
Excellent. I like your definition a lot. And here's a couple other things I usually associate with it. It's a personal philosophy. It's a hypothesis, maybe you could say, about ultimate reality. It's a set of answers to some really basic questions like, what's the prime reality? What's the thing from which everything else comes? God? Is it matter? Is it the laws of nature? Is it something else? What's the nature of human nature? What are we like? Are we basically good? Are we basically selfish? Are we totally determined by our genes and our environment, or do we have free will? These kinds of questions. A worldview question is kind of more philosophical question about some really basic things, about the nature of ultimate reality, the nature of human nature, the nature of the world around us in general terms, okay? Let's look at some basic worldviews, because I think this is really critical. The most important question that worldview answers is, What is the prime reality? What's the thing from which everything else comes? If we think about that question, what are some possible answers to that basic question? What is the thing from which everything else comes?
God.
What's the thing that's always been here? One answer is God. Okay, that's an obvious answer. Christians, Jews, people of Islamic faith, they think it's God. And typically religious theists think of God as a person, a mind, a spirit, someone that is conscious, to whom you can pray, and so forth. Okay? What's another thing from which everything else could come? What's another candidate to be the prime reality?
Big Bang.
The Big Bang, well, the Big Bang is a theory about the origin of the universe. We're going to talk about that tomorrow.
Okay.
But I think what you're getting at is that there are some people who think that the matter that was way back there is the thing from which everything else comes.
Yes.
Am I reading your mail? Okay. Okay, so I don't think people say that anymore, actually. That's a very...
Okay.
I'm only hip from like the 1970s, so don't think I'm really cool. It's all put on. Okay, so, all right, that's good, yeah. Matter, okay. Or if you're a physics guy, you know that matter and energy are interchangeable. So sometimes materialists, that's a worldview, will say matter and energy are the thing from which everything else came. Or else they'll say matter and energy and the laws of nature that act upon them is the thing from which everything else came. So I got a cool diagram there, but one I drew over here that displays my artistic ability, such as it is. Okay, and what I do, these are my famous worldview diagrams. They're not actually famous. But the circle represents physical reality. Inside represents a pendulum, okay? And the pendulum, rather, is representing the laws of nature. And then you've got all the physical stuff. That's a planet, that's a sun, that's a star, in case you didn't know. This is an animule here, and mountains and trees and stuff. Okay, so according to the materialists, the thing from which everything else came is matter. That matter combined evolved and eventually more complex life arose, and that finally produced us. Now, according to theists, it's a very different answer. Theists think that the thing from which everything else came is a personal God, an eternal self-existent being, omnipotent perhaps, omnipresent perhaps, but the idea is that God is a person and a mind who is conscious, who has intentions, and that God brought the universe into existence. Classical theists think that God created the world, created the universe, that God upholds the world, and that God also sometimes enters the universe and acts as an agent in the universe that he otherwise sustains and upholds. Acting as an agent is another word for like a miraculous event, like parting the Red Sea. Okay, so that's another idea, another a key worldview that we're going to encounter. And deism is a kind of modified version of theism where God only creates the world and then does nothing beyond that. But there's one other really big system of thought that you find is more Eastern. It's the idea of pantheism. And that idea is that there is a God, but that God is not personal. God is more like the Force in Star Wars, you know, kind of an impersonal oneness that binds everything together, but is not in any way conscious or aware or intelligent or rational, anything like that. It's a mystical oneness. So in the pantheistic worldview, let's see, I got to get another picture of this on the blackboard too. Okay, and so here's the idea here of God is this one, okay? In the East, they say Atman is Brahman, the soul of the world is the soul of the one, the soul of God. So God is connected to all the parts of the physical world are part of God. So there's God in this desk, God in this table, God in you, God in me, God in the computer, God in the trees, the flowers, and that's the pantheistic idea. So there's 3 or 4 different worldviews, big worldviews that we'll be talking about. Materialism, matter's the prime reality. Theism, personal God is the prime reality. Deism, a personal but remote God is the prime reality. And pantheism, an impersonal God is the prime reality. So which of those ideas about ultimate reality is the right idea? Which is the one that is the thing from which everything else came? Well, that's one of the big questions that we're going to be looking at. In fact, the first one. And you can think of that question in 2 ways. You can say, what is the prime reality? A little more open-ended. We're going to consider all of them. Or you can also say, does God exist? Because God is one of the key candidates, you know? And so we're going to be looking at that question. Now, one of the ways we're going to do that, we're going to be using some reason, okay? A form of reason that's a bit like the way detectives reason. Because what we have in the world around us are a lot of clues. And those clues can be interpreted in different ways. And what we want to do is make the best sense we can of those clues and make an inference about what is most likely to be true about this prime reality. I use the phrase reasons for faith. We've defined the kind of faith we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about a belief system or a worldview, but what kind of reason are we going to be using? Well, there's a number of different kinds of reason that you can encounter. One is the idea of deductive reasoning. And this you encounter in logic class. Socrates is a man. No, how's that go? All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore what? He's mortal, therefore he'll die, okay? That's just the application of a general rule to a particular case to get a certain outcome. That's what deductive reasoning does. Another kind of reason is called induction. That's a form of reasoning that scientists often use, and it's the idea that if you make observations of the same kind of phenomenon over and over again, then you draw a generalization. So if I drop something like these lovely tennis balls, and I drop one and what falls, I say, okay, this an unsupported body fell to the ground. Okay, do it again. Unsupported body number 2 falls to the ground. Number 3 falls to the ground. Hey, I got an idea. Here's my law of gravity. All unsupported bodies fall. Okay. Induction, what it does is that you see a number of cases of a particular kind of thing happening, and then you make an inference about that thing always happening under certain conditions. Okay. What we're looking at is a bunch of clues, and we're trying to figure out what caused those clues to come into existence. We're going to be looking at some things about the cosmos, about life, about the laws of physics, and we're going to say what caused those peculiar features to be as they are. And this form of reasoning has another name. It's called abduction. It's the kind of reasoning that Sherlock Holmes used and detectives used. It turns out Charles Darwin used. And it's a typical form of reasoning in science where you're trying to reason from effects back to causes. When we're asking about the prime reality, the thing from which everything else came, we're asking a question about ultimate causation. This is the form of reasoning we're going to be looking at. So here's an illustration of this form of reasoning. We've got a footprint in the ground, right? Only it's on the moon. What can we infer from that? Can we say anything about what caused it? We got an effect. Now we want to reason back to the cause. Yeah, what's your idea?
Something was on the moon?
Yeah, maybe somebody with a boot, right? Okay, maybe an astronaut or something, okay? So, that's the kind of inference, that's an abductive inference, moving from effects back to cause. Now, that's a really good way to reason, but there's one real small problem with it. It can be uncertain, okay? Here's another abductive argument. If it rains, the streets will get wet. Anyone disagree with that? Okay, that's just our background knowledge. Now, we go outside, we see, hey, there's water on the streets. What can we infer? Can we infer that it rained?
No.
From the effect? We can't, can we? Why not?
Could have been a fire hydrant or something.
Okay, it might have been a fire hydrant. It might have been, some guys in a dorm firing water balloons. It might have been somebody washed the car. I mean, a lot of other possible causes, all right? So when we're trying to reason from an effect back to a cause using this abductive form of reasoning, sometimes we got to be aware that there may be more than one cause of the same effect. So we've got to look at the other possibilities real carefully before we make any real definitive conclusion, okay? So in order to get around this problem, scientists have developed another method of reasoning. Philosophers use this too, and this is the method that we're going to be using mainly in the class. It's called the method of multiple competing hypotheses, okay? The idea of multiple competing hypotheses is that if you've got an effect that can be explained in a number of different ways, you want to evaluate each one of those hypotheses to see which one best explains the evidence. Let's say one of the hypotheses is the water balloon hypothesis, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. If you're trying to decide between it rained and water balloons, what are you going to look for?
Plastic from the water balloon?
Yeah, little shrapnel, little rubber shards of water balloons, okay? Also, you'd look for a patch of water or is the water everywhere? Because that's what rain does, right?
Yeah.
But if it's a fire hydrant or maybe somebody washing a car or a water balloon, it's going to be more localized, right? Mm-hmm. So you're going to look for other clues to try to adjudicate. Between the different hypotheses to see which one provides the best explanation, okay? So if you get in a place where you got one piece of evidence that can be explained in multiple ways, to get to the place where you can infer the best explanation, sometimes you're going to have to look at more evidence, all right? And we're going to use that method. And we call that method inferring to the best explanation. Okay, any questions?
So when you're talking about this, the multiple competing hypothesis,
Right.
That is not 100% proof either, though.
Exactly.
Neither with
That's
the,
a great
any
point.
of the other ones.
Okay, but notice the source of uncertainty with the abductive form of reasoning was that you had more than one possible cause that could explain the same event. All right. So if you can eliminate that source of uncertainty, so that there's only one cause that can explain all the evidence that you're looking at, you're in a much stronger position. In a court of law, they sometimes will talk about beyond reasonable doubt.
Yes.
There's a point where the evidence piles up and there's only one cause that will explain that evidence, and then you're in a position where you can infer it's beyond reasonable doubt, but still not mathematically certain proof like you get in geometry, okay? And that's the way we reason in ordinary life. Nobody gets absolute proof of anything. And in a sense, the God question, the questions of prime reality and ultimate reality are no different. You don't get absolute certainty, but you might have a lot of good reasons to believe one view of ultimate reality over another. And that's what I'm going to argue, that theistic belief is well supported, lots of good evidence, might even provide the best explanation. In fact, I'm going to argue that, but it won't, you still can't prove things absolutely. Because actually, with the exception of geometry, we can prove almost nothing absolutely.
Okay.
Okay, so what makes an explanation best? If we're saying that the good form of reasoning is to infer the best explanation. Well, philosophers and scientists who have studied this question have come to a kind of consensus on this, and they think the best explanation is one that provides the most adequate causal explanation. So that's the key criterion we're going to look at, and since we're looking at the question of the prime reality, and that prime reality is essentially a question of ultimate causation. If we say, what's the thing from which everything else came, that's a question about cause, about causality. And so this is the method that we're going to use to investigate that question. And that's where this gets really exciting, because we can apply these common forms of reasoning, this particular common form of reasoning, which is used in science, in law, and in philosophy, we can apply that to this question of what's the thing from which everything else comes. And we can evaluate competing worldviews by reference to this method of reasoning. So if we think of the worldviews we've looked at, materialism or naturalism, deism, pantheism, theism, each of these worldviews invokes a different kind of entity as the thing from which everything else comes. And we can evaluate whether those entities have the causal power to produce the kinds of evidence that we're going to be looking at. Evidence from cosmology, evidence from physics and the laws of physics, evidence from biology. We're going to look at evidence from the natural world and see which one of these big worldviews provides the best explanation of that evidence and some of our ordinary experience as well. So tomorrow, we're going to begin looking at whether or not there are reasons for faith, but I thought it was important before we got going to have a good look at what we mean by reason, what we mean by faith, and what the relationship is between the two. So tomorrow we'll start looking at evidence, and I think that's going to be really exciting as well.
So what are you willing to do to really prepare yourself to give a reason for your beliefs? At times, this series is going to feel like a lot of work. It was designed on purpose to be challenging. But whether you're planning on attending college or entering the workforce, the challenge waiting for you is an aggressive opposition set on trivializing your belief in God. The Apostle Peter said to always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you, to give a reason for the hope that you have. Are you willing and able to do that?